Mr. Gruber, in your testimony, you mentioned H.R. 7049, the HEATS Act would, quote, remove the Secretary's ability to ensure that geothermal operations are conducted safely and are following all applicable environmental laws. Mr. Gruber, I'm sure you're aware California already has very strict environmental laws, and in some cases stricter than what the federal government has imposed on citizens, EV mandates, et cetera, by 2030. What are you trying to imply that if this bill were to be enacted into law, that California geothermal operators would not continue to follow federal and state laws?
Thank you for that question. The Secretary has a duty under FLPMA to ensure that federal resources are managed according to federal law, and H.R. 7409 would take the Secretary's oversight out of the process.
But so even though we've got state governments that regulate geothermal, and part of the conjunctive use of state lands is energy, as well as oftentimes these forest lands, logging, harvest, habitat, watershed, you're afraid that it sounds like one of the most innocuous energy development types of projects there is are some threat to the Secretary's mission to protect these state lands?
Again, under FLPMA, the Secretary of the Interior has the responsibility to ensure the responsible management of federal resources, and H.R. 7409 would change that.
Sure. And please tell me a horror story that would frighten me in terms of some mishap that's occurred with geothermal energy development recently that requires the Secretary's involvement to protect such federal interests.
Thank you. I'm not aware of an example at this moment, but I can tell you that public safety, environmental responsibility are priorities of the administration, and that's ensuring safe operations on federal lands and involving federal resources is a priority for the department.
So this is federal priority to, I call it regulation by imagination. If you can't show me an example of what risk we're curing, why is there a federal government process that protects the federal interests? What is the interest you're protecting if you can't identify a risk?
Ultimately, we're protecting the interests of the American people. These are federally managed resources that are owned and managed for the public.
Yeah. Dr. Jones, what are we doing here? I mean, the American people want this sustainable, clean, safe energy that seems to be one of the freest things we can get. What are the disadvantages of having a federal regulatory load on this energy source that doesn't seem to be founded in any real world experience?
I think some of the disadvantages is that we are slowing down our ability to address climate change and progress the clean energy transition. And to your question about any negative consequences of geothermal, the only one that I can think of is when Boise, Idaho's had their district use had a leak in it over New Year's Day, and hot water was coming out onto the streets, and it was New Year's Eve night, and people were just walking around, took their shoes off and walked around in the hot water, and it was sort of steaming up. And you can see pictures on the City of Boise's website about people sort of experiencing a special New Year's Eve treat of hot water in downtown Boise. And that's probably that's an example of a consequence that might happen.
It's a pretty broad panel here. Can any of you else otherwise tell me why we need to regulate geothermal at a very involved federal level to protect some federal interest in regulating what might be imagined? So it seems to me that we're talking about making available one of the easiest energy sources possible that we should be expanding. I mean, we're subsidizing windmills to a point of $1 trillion. We're subsidizing solar panels across the landscape. But here, this seems to be one of the safest, most benign energy sources possible that we could. What do you think, Dr. Jones? What are the potentials for expanded geothermal development if we relieve some of these bureaucratic
They're huge.
constraints?
We could power 16 million homes in the United States with geothermal. We could decarbonize the built environment. We could, dairy farmers and ranchers could use geothermal to process their products. We could dehydrate onions and potatoes and all sorts of other vegetable and food processes. We could make beer, and we can use geothermal heat for all of those, and we can decarbonize the grid as well.
Are the wrong people making money on this, or what's wrong here? I mean, we're subsidizing solar and wind, but we won't let geothermal just take its course through a rationalized regulatory framework. This is regulation by imagination. This is the worst waste of federal resources that I can imagine. Thank you much. I yield back.